Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in the clown decade. The decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better, and man, this video really does show how clown decade things have got with the people that are supposed to be running the country. As Peter Hitchens famously once said,
"It's not Britain I hate, Britain I love, every field and hedgerow. It's the people who run it."
And this video is going to go through a pretty comprehensive article as to why, especially when it comes to the civil service and our counter-terrorism task force in the civil service, which is PREVENT. Now, there's no point beating around the bush here, we may as well just get straight into it. Scandalous indoctrination inside a King's College counter-terrorism course for UK civil servants. In other words, this is a course put together by one of our greatest academic institutions that is supposed to give decent to very good guidance to the civil servants within PREVENT about how to deal with terrorism within the UK. And oh, trust me, this is as bad as you are going to be expecting if you have been following any sort of news around the civil service or around universities for the past 5 to 10 years. So first off, an introduction to the author of this article. A former civil servant, Anna Stanley, reports on a counter-terrorism course she attended which found deeply existentially depressing experience. She argues that prestigious education institutions are delivering politically biased anti-government training, amounting to indoctrination, and that extremism and terrorism are misunderstood by civil servants to the point of being a national security risk. And to be frank with you, I'm not shocked about this at all, because I even remember back when the Manchester Arena bombing happened. Places like the BBC would have panels and introduce people like Douglas Murray to come on to effectively say what the actual problem is, which is we have Islamist terrorists absolutely everywhere, and they were effectively tokens to be put on and berated by the rest of the panel and the presenter. And that's generally how it's seen. If you say, well, this is clearly an issue with religion and Islam specifically, and when it gets very extreme, that's clearly where we should be focusing at the moment, I mean, you'll see, but you are effectively called a racist or, you know, a pleb, essentially, a know-nothing pleb. I recently attended a King's College course called Issues in Counter-Terrorism, organised by the Centre for Defence Studies. It was designed for civil servants and professionals in counter-terrorism. Staff from the Foreign Office, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Defence and Home Office attended, facilitating this relatively new 3-day course where senior lecturers from the Security Studies Department. The civil servants were given presentations by King's College lecturers, while visiting senior research fellows and professors also spoke. These included those formerly holding positions such as Permanent Secretary of the Home Office and Director of GCHQ, Defence Minister, and Foreign Office Director. The course was a deeply, existentially depressing experience. And I can completely understand why, because all of these people that are supposed to be focusing on the national security of the entire country and its people will, like pretty much everybody in government these days, be more worried about their own status and how they look to the other people within government than actually how they look and how they can protect those that they are supposed to be representing and protecting, i.e. the plebs of the country. Prestigious educational institutions are delivering politically biased anti-government training amounting to indoctrination. It confirmed my fears that extremism and terrorism are misunderstood by civil servants to the point of being a national security risk. I mean, if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. Underpinning their presentations, some of the lecturers relayed typical postmodern identity politics. I.e., people who aren't white can't be blamed for their own actions because the white man oppressed them in the past. It'll be things like that. Even though a lot of Islamist countries in the past had much, much worse attitudes towards slaves than the British ever did. The course began with the issue of definitions. What is terrorism? Without anyone providing an opposing standpoint, we were taught the adage, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. In other words, it is the official position of PREVENT and the UK's counter-terrorism task forces that the Manchester Arena bomber, who blew up 22 children, could technically be accurately defined as a freedom fighter. And if that alone doesn't show you that the civil service needs to be completely gutted and reformed from the bottom up, I don't know what will convince you. I posed to the room that surely we can acknowledge subjectivity while being able to come up with a collective understanding of what terrorism is. Some 40 civil servants looked at me blankly. No? I wondered why we were there. Well, as you've perfectly said at the beginning of this article, you were there to be indoctrinated. You were there not to think maybe there's an issue with Islam, because if you start saying that, you're going to see quite a few cities within the UK have Muslims effectively rise up. It's probably genuinely somewhere in hidden documents somewhere, official party lines within the civil service, that we keep quiet about the problem with Islam and Islamists within the country because they think that things will be more peaceful. Well, there are going to be more examples of the Leicester unrest in the future, I can guarantee that, and those unrests had absolutely nothing to do with native British people whatsoever. We have literally imported tensions over from India and Pakistan. The danger of understanding terrorism with cultural relativism is that it breeds moral apathy. The kind that say, who are we to mere democratic, liberal Westerners to impose our morality onto others? Who are we to say our culture is superior to others? These are luxury attitudes. It is easy to be sat in King's College London and feel that all cultures are equal when you haven't been anally raped at a peace festival by someone shouting Allahu Akbar and held hostage. Yes, we're bringing Israel-Gaza issues into this article, and yes, once again, Israel's response to Hamas doing those sorts of things, to Israelis who are actually calling for peace, yeah, they deserve to get absolutely bombed off the face of the earth. These people do not deserve any sort of rights. In the introduction to the course, labelling any organisation as terrorist was described as a problem because it implies a moral judgment. Nothing was said about why a moral judgment might be inappropriate. Yeah, this is the fifth layer liberalism stuff where, if you don't know what I mean by that, it's all explained in another video I did called The Huge Blocker to Debating Liberalism. It's 40 minutes long, sure, but just to summarise it, Layer 5 liberalism is essentially modern, postmodern neo-Marxism. It's this trying to get perfect equality between all sorts of group identities. It's effectively intersectionality in saying that all groups are equal, but obviously they're Marxist, so they think that all the historically oppressed groups should be on top. And this is exactly what's happening here. They are thinking, well, Muslims have been oppressed in the past because of Islamophobia or something like that, and that's all come from moral judgments, and therefore if we make moral judgments, that's on the first step to being Islamophobic, and we can't have that. And this is the absolutely huge problem. This person who is within the civil service, or was in the civil service, and was obviously in these counter-terrorism courses, she is quite clearly a layer, I don't know if it's 1 to 4. If I were to guess, I would say layer 3 liberal, which is your John Stuart Mill type of liberal, who would say that the highest point for anyone's liberty is to completely free the individual of any other sort of group identity and group pressures forced upon the individual. But she's possibly layer 4 as well, which says this sort of development of the individual can only happen through welfare. It's kind of hard to say. The point is that she is against the politics of identity, which is what layer 5 liberalism is, and this is why the recent spat with Sargon on Twitter means that Sargon is effectively right. The modern communists are another type of liberal, unfortunately, and everyone else is trying to reject that but not doing a very good job of it. Doing such a bad job of it, in fact, that it is just the overarching worldview within all of these new elite institutions, the civil service, academia, and this is all over the world. This isn't just in Britain. This is in America, this is happening to some degree throughout Europe as well, but it seems to be affecting the US and the UK the most. More developed countries and those higher up on the GDP scale seem to be much more susceptible to this infestation of layer 5 liberals. And the perfect example is coming up here. All the civil servant participants were given a topic to research and present. One attendee said her brother had been radicalised and fought in Syria for Islamic State, ISIS. Phew, I thought, at least one person here will understand the problem of extremism, but her presentation was about the UK's counter-terrorism strategy Prevent. She argued Prevent is inherently racist because it focuses on Islamist extremism. The mere mention of Islamist extremism makes Muslims feel uncomfortable, she argued, and her brother would most certainly have agreed. And therefore, that made him think, I've got to go off to the Middle East and fight with ISIS against literally everyone else, where the main enemy isn't Britain and Prevent, although Britain was involved in fighting ISIS. No, you don't join ISIS because Prevent targeted Islamists. You join ISIS because you are an Islamist. But this is exactly what layer 5 liberalism is. It is the post-modern neo-Marxism. It is all about the people. It is filled with the people saying the only reason people do bad things is because they feel their group identity is attacked. It's about historic oppression and current oppression. That is the only reason they do it, and it's perfectly reasonable for them to do it. Which doesn't make any sense, because even in the Muslim community, which is apparently being oppressed by Prevent, it's not majority of Muslims going over to fight for ISIS. It is a vast minority, so their argument doesn't even make sense. I raised the point that nearly 70% of terrorist attacks in the UK are Islamist. Similarly, 70% of lung cancer cases are caused by smoking, and it would be absurd to avoid mentioning this in the study of cancer so smokers don't feel uncomfortable. Unsurprisingly, this comparison was not well received. Well, that's because you're racist, obviously. It's just crazy. This is our counter-terrorism task force. This is the head of the departments that is supposed to protect us from more Manchester bombings, and their strategy is just to say, hashtag not all. Which nobody is saying all, and is a complete waste of time when you could instead be arresting the troublemakers and deporting them or putting them in prison forever for, being terrorists. Later on, we were shown an ISIS propaganda recruitment video filmed in Syria. The same attendee's face lit up, laughing and pointing at the jihadi in the video. He used to go to my school. I know him, she explained. Mouth agape, I looked around the room for responses to yet another disclosure involving personal links to ISIS terrorists. I appeared to be the only one that finds this extraordinary. Yeah, Prevent just has people that casually know ISIS terrorists, and for some reason absolutely no investigation seems to go within it. I mean, I'll give them this. I reckon that they'll do background checks before you can actually join the Prevent program to, stop terrorism, to make sure that they don't have actual terrorist sympathisers in there. But, I have to be with Anna on this. It's very odd that someone can just be in the middle of a Prevent meeting and just exclaim, oh, I know that terrorist, and absolutely no one bats an eye. It's just like, cool. What? If in World War II you were in the War Office and you said, oh yeah, I know Goebbels, I know him personally, someone would raise an eyebrow. But obviously if you say, I know a brown guy and he's a terrorist, lol, apparently that's just normal. There was an irony to being surrounded by civil servants who hate the concept of the state. As young professionals, they represented a microcosm of the views emanating from British universities. When it comes to extremism and counter-terrorism, the state is not to be trusted. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to literal healthcare and giving out welfare, the state should be trusted, but obviously only in the hands of the good guys, who, as we know in the past, have not done a good job with that. The head of security studies at King's College read concernedly, problems of definitions, labelling a group terrorist can increase the state's power. The civil servants nodded in agreement. Yeah, well, again, I'm pretty libertarian when it comes to these things, but I am actually okay with the state having power to literally stop terrorists by any means necessary. That's one of the few things I actually want the state to do. And one of the big ones would be literally deport them, but as this article shows, we are barely even deporting ISIS terrorists. In fact, I actually went out to actually look for the article now, and I've actually reread it. Yeah, no, it's even worse than that. We're literally giving ISIS terrorists literal citizenship. And it's because the civil servants have no will to do it, because effectively they think it's Britain's fault and the government's fault due to past oppression and basically the war in Iraq that led to all these terrorist groups and Islamist groups existing. When, of course, if you read any sort of history, Islamist groups have existed since the beginning of Islam, since 600 odd AD. The visiting speakers were political heavyweights, possessing genuine expertise with interesting anecdotes. Their past responses to crises like the Northern Ireland Troubles were referenced frequently, yet I couldn't help but feel many of their insights were lost by the audience. One attendee provocatively asked a former head of GCHQ whether he felt bad infringing on our civil liberties in the pursuit of terrorists. Naive and uninformed, the questioner had highlighted mainstream opinion that security service were routinely listening to innocent random people's phone calls or stalking their WhatsApps. Lacking was any appreciation the UK is exemplary. Protective legislation is laborious to the point of being near obstructive, and investigations pursuing criminals and terrorists are rigorously audited. And no doubt in my mind that they get it wrong sometimes. But if it's stopping the death of our countrymen, we can take some phone tapping of innocent people. I mean, as the article says, these things are really well audited as to not infringe on people who have done absolutely nothing wrong. But it's never going to be perfect. Again, if you're within Prevent, sure, it's fine to have the mindset of let's not go after innocent people, but that's not the problem at the moment. The problem we have at the moment is that we have had at least a substantial, that's the second highest by the way, at least a substantial threat of terrorism in the UK for well over 2 years now. It's pretty much not dropped since the Manchester Arena bombing. And yet people at Prevent are asking, but what about the innocent people? It's like, yeah, sure, they're the people you're supposed to stop being bombed. Like, I get it. I think it's great that we've got people in Prevent thinking, let's not overstretch our power here. But they seem to be at a point where all they're aiming to do is actually just neuter Prevent. And even as a bit of a libertarian, I want them to be, a bit more proactive in actually showing the terrorists that they've caught and put in jail. Because as far as I'm aware, there's barely any. I'm sure there are people they have caught constantly. I'm sure there are hard-working people there, but that's hard to defend when articles like this come out and it appears that absolutely everyone in the civil service within Prevent is for stopping Prevent existing. Israel was referenced throughout the course. We were told some consider Hamas terrorists as freedom fighters, whereas Israel was provided as an example where considering the question of whether a state can commit terrorism. In the introduction, one slide read, condemning terrorism is to endorse the power of the strong over the weak. A dangerous conclusion breeding anti-Israeli positions. And again, perfect example of fifth layer postmodern neo-Marxist liberalism, which I understand the irony of saying that post-Marxism can be liberalism, but that's where the postmodernism comes in. It nicely tries to stitch them together, but it ends up just becoming a complete mess. In this perspective, Israel is seen as a powerful aggressor and the Palestinians military disadvantaged in asymmetric warfare. Thus, the Palestinians are inherently oppressed, an axiom that fuels the view that Israel is a terrorist state and Hamas atrocities are justifiably contextualised. To call Hamas terrorists, as the BBC is so potently resistant to doing, will be to endorse the power of the strong over the weak, or just to reflect reality, because I don't see how killing over 1,000 people and raping women in the process is anything other than terrorism. Another slide read, terrorism is not the problem, rather the systems they oppose are terrorist, reflecting postmodern identity politics wrapped up as counter-terrorism education. Everything was viewed through the lens of power. And of course, when it comes to terrorism, I don't understand how you can't see a man who blew himself up along with 22 kids as anything other than that particular man trying to be the most powerful he has ever felt in his life. But hey, these people probably believe in power plus prejudice equals racism. In other words, he can't be a terrorist because he quote-unquote has no power, though I think taking away 22 lives at once is a pretty good indicator of quite a lot of power in that moment. While the lecturer did not explicitly present the slides as reflecting his own beliefs, he said nothing to counter them, which is just as good as saying that they are my beliefs. I'm grateful I attended the course before the October 7 Hamas terrorist attack. I have no doubt the pogrom would have been contextually justified as merely the oppressed countering the oppressor, with Israel's response described as morally equivalent or worse to the atrocities. I think you're putting far too much faith in the civil service there, but with that context, at least I can give the civil service in this particular instance some leeway. None of the counter-terrorism lecturers, bar two, posted about the attacks on their otherwise informative social media platforms. One of these two, of the professors, wrote a RUSI think tank commentary saying Israeli crisis meetings could be affected by desire for revenge and why restraint in counter-terrorism is so important. And I do agree, there is a bit of difference between justice and revenge. I don't think it's reasonable to nuke Gaza for what they did to the Israelis, but I think what Israel are doing at the moment is fairly considered proportionate. During the span of the course, there was no mention of immigration being relevant to terrorism in the UK, except as a view given by the right wing. And that, I think, more than anything goes to show how unserious most people in Prevent are. The course's overriding emphasis was that Islamist extremism is exaggerated. Okay. Right-wing extremism was given more weight than is proportionate. And all this is apparently in conflict with William Shawcross's findings in the latest Government Commission review of its anti-radicalisation programme, Prevent. So as it turns out, Prevent is actually one of the relatively competent areas of the government when it comes to countering extremism. Clearly, their findings are actually showing accurately what the problems are, in that Islamist terrorism is quite a big problem, and when it comes to right-wing extremism, that's being exaggerated instead by the civil service and other areas of the government. We've literally got Prevent showing the receipts for that. One lecturer derogatively described Shawcross as the type of person who would say all current counter-terrorism professionals are woke. He's of that ilk. This, of course, discredited Shawcross to the court attendees, who, from everything I've seen in this article so far, yeah, I think it's fair to say that they're woke. The lecturer further argued that Douglas Murray and Joe Rogan are both examples of the far right, and to what extent should Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray be suppressed, he asked. They have millions of followers. To deplatform them would cause issues. I would love to hear of one single terrorist event, or one person even planning terrorism, who quotes either Joe Rogan or Douglas Murray as one of their influences. Unironically, by the way, because obviously we've had terrorists citing PewDiePie as one of their influences, because if you're a right-wing terrorist, I would not be surprised if you are into those sorts of memes. Concluding his talk, the lecturer told a room full of government professionals society needs to find other ways to suppress them. Which absolutely blows my mind. You have an entire lecture and course on how to counter extremism, and their conclusion is we need to suppress the Joe Rogan podcast and make sure that Douglas Murray can't write for The Spectator anymore. I'm actually amazed there was no mention of Joe Cox, who was killed by a far-right extremist, and it's actually fair to say that. But I suppose they have to kind of go against the idea, because if you bring up Joe Cox, you are just begging people to bring up David Amos, who was stabbed to death by an Islamist terrorist at a constituency surgery. So I suppose at least they're not that stupid, but bringing up Joe Rogan, it's just absolutely ridiculous to say that is causing far-right extremism. Because Joe Rogan brings all sorts of people on his podcast. He's just a guy who likes asking questions, but I suppose if you ask the wrong questions, you're far right. So if you wanted any evidence that the civil service hates you, this article is it. I would not be shocked if you showed any of my videos to this group who were on this counterterrorism course. The general consensus would be that I am an extremist and I should be investigated and taken to court. I would not be surprised at that, and my views aren't even that extreme when it comes to the mainstream. My most extreme views are that universal suffrage is questionable, and it is absolutely justified to have firearms for your own personal self-defense in civilized society. They're probably my two most unpopular opinions, and as for the rest of them, when it comes to immigration, yeah, I want it lowered completely. Probably not to net zero. I don't know how realistic that is, but I'm with most people in that it obviously needs to be substantially lowered. I'm with most of the country in that people who cross over to our country illegally over the channel should instantly be deported, whether they're a genuine refugee or not. I'm obviously not with most of the country that the NHS needs radical reform and to not be a just horrendous socialist institution, but I hardly think that we can describe that as extremist. But you never know with these civil servants, because they are so far left that I'd wager even Chairman Mao looks right-wing to them. But this is the reality of what we've got. These are the people running the country. They are people that just quite frankly hate you. And the only thing I can see that can be done about it is to completely tear up the civil service, root and stem, and reform it to be something that has its power completely neutered, because it's supposed to be Parliament that is sovereign, not the civil service, not the Supreme Court, not private secretaries, none of that. Parliament, that is the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but unfortunately, I do mean this at this point, it doesn't really make a difference who's in Parliament anyway. I reckon even if you've got reform in there, I don't think they can do enough within a term to actually neuter the civil service. If we're going to fight them, we need like a 10-year plan at the very least. At least 3 terms in office for whichever party gets in, whose sole purpose is to completely neuter the civil service. And the only way we're going to get to a place like that is by, voting for more right-wing parties, voting for reform. They're not the best, they're not even what we're looking for. But it shows the direction that we want the country to go, and that's the most important part. So it will not solve anything whatsoever, but it's better than spoiling your ballot and doing absolutely nothing about it. It's very little, I'm very aware of that. But we need to do a Gramsci and actually get into all these institutions and try and hide our power levels till we're in a position where we can actually change them from the inside. And we're talking a couple of decades' work here, but there's no reason we can't do it. And I myself am trying to do it in the private sector. I'm trying to make it further into my job and my career to get to the top of a business where I can actually influence, hopefully, a business that will grow and be influential. The only way I can do it is by working harder, so I suggest you do that too. It's literally our only chance. Anyway, with all that, I'm sorry it's a bit of a Blackpilling Friday video. I try not to do that, but hey, it's the weekend, you'll cheer yourself up. So that's everything I had for you today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.